The morning that was to change everything began, as so many momentous days do, with the complete ordinariness of breakfast. I was sharing lodgings once again with Hercule Poirot in his immaculate flat at Whitehaven Mansions, having found myself temporarily between accommodations due to what my friend diplomatically termed the inevitable consequences of the bachelor existence. Poirot, who regarded disorder as a personal affront to the universe, had taken me in with his characteristic mixture of resignation and barely concealed horror at my domestic habits. On this particular October morning, he sat at his perfectly appointed breakfast table, examining his soft-boiled egg with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a diamond. The egg, I observed, had committed the cardinal sin of being slightly asymmetrical. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, tapping the shell delicately with his spoon. "The curve is imperfect. Nature, she mocks the principles of geometry. It is a small thing, yes, but small things, they have a way of reflecting larger truths about the world's tendency toward chaos. I expect the hen wasn't thinking about your aesthetic sensibilities, Poirot," I replied, buttering my toast. He shuddered delicately. "Precisely the problem, mon ami. No one thinks anymore. They act on impulse, on emotion, without consideration for order, for method. And yet—" He paused, his green eyes suddenly sharpening as our landlady, Mrs. Pearson, entered with the Morning Post. Perhaps the day brings something more promising than irregular poultry. She placed the letters beside his coffee cup with the reverence of one presenting state documents. "3 for you, Mr. Poirot, and 2 for Captain Hastings. That foreign one looks important, if you don't mind my saying." When she had withdrawn, Poirot arranged the correspondence in a precise fan before him, examining each envelope with the methodical attention he brought to everything. "Bills, invitations to tedious social functions, a letter from my tailor—" He paused, lifting a cream-colored envelope with an elaborate foreign postmark. "But this, Hastings, this is different. Buenos Aires. And the handwriting, observe the careful formation of the letters, the slight tremor that speaks of emotion held tightly in check. This is from someone in distress." "Buenos Aires," I repeated, and felt an odd stirring of memory. Something about that name, that distant city, seemed to whisper of warm nights and music, of a time when I was younger and the world held different possibilities. Poirot's sharp eyes missed nothing. I see the geography awakens something in you, mon ami. The expression, it becomes wistful, perhaps romantic." "Don't be absurd," I said, though I felt heat rising in my cheeks. With his customary precision, he slit open the envelope and extracted a single sheet of paper. As he read, his expression grew grave, and once he glanced at me with a curious intensity. "This," he said, finally folding the letter, "is most interesting, and I think almost certainly dangerous." He handed me the letter. "Read, mon ami. It concerns you as much as it concerns me." The handwriting was indeed careful, feminine, with the slight flourishes that betrayed a foreign hand writing in English. "Monsieur Poirot, you do not know me, but I know of your reputation. They speak of the famous Belgian detective even here in Argentina, and I pray you will not dismiss the plea of a frightened girl. My name is Esperanza Valdez. I'm 22 years old, and I'm in terrible danger. 3 weeks ago, I traveled to England as the guest of Lady Pemberton at Greystone Manor in Surrey. I came because of an inheritance. My late aunt left me a considerable sum, and certain legal matters required my presence in London. But something is wrong here, monsieur. Very wrong. 2 days ago, a man died at Greystone Manor. They say it was an accident, that Mr. Charles Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's stepson, fell from the library balcony while reaching for a book. But I saw him only an hour before. He was not the careless type, and he spoke to me of fear. 'Someone wants me gone,' he said. 'If anything happens to me, remember that.' Now they watch me constantly. They smile and speak of my delicate nerves and my foreign imagination, But I see the calculation in their eyes. My inheritance is substantial, nearly £50,000. If I were to die here, far from home, with no family to ask questions, I cannot go to the police. I am a foreigner, and the Pembertons are an old English family with influence. But I remembered something. A conversation I had in Buenos Aires with Captain Hastings when he was stationed there. He spoke of his friend, the great detective. He said if ever I needed help in England, I should mention his name. Please, monsieur, come to Greystone Manor. Say you are visiting Captain Hastings' friend from Argentina. They cannot refuse you. Perhaps you will tell me I am foolish, that there is nothing to fear. I will be grateful to be foolish. But if there is wickedness here, you will see it. I sign with my pet name, the one Captain Hastings knew me by. In desperate hope, Esperanza P.S. Ask Captain Hastings if he remembers the night at the Café Tortoni when the lights went out and someone played La Comparsita on a single violin. He will know then that I am truly she. I lowered the letter, my mind reeling. The Café Tortoni. Yes, I remembered it now. A warm evening, the scent of jasmine, and a girl with dark eyes who had laughed at my clumsy attempts to dance the tango. Esperanza, how could I have forgotten? You remember her? Poirot observed, watching my face. Yes, I said slowly. But that was years ago, Poirot. She was just a girl then, barely 18, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. We were friends. Friends, Poirot repeated with a slight smile. Ah, the English and their careful definitions of the heart. But no matter. What matters is that this young lady is afraid, and she has invoked your name as a passport to safety. The question is, do we accept her invitation? I looked at him in surprise. You mean you're considering it? Consider it. Mon ami, I'm already planning what to pack. He rose from the table, his movements suddenly crisp with decision. Here we have all the elements that appeal to Hercule Poirot. A closed circle, the country house, the limited number of suspects. A death that appears accidental but may be murder. A young woman in danger, isolated among those who may wish her harm, and... He paused, straightening his tie with satisfaction. And the challenge to my little grey cells. But surely, I protested, if there's real danger. Then we must act quickly, Poirot interrupted. Fear, Hastings, is like a fever. It spreads. If someone has already killed once at Greystone Manor, they will not hesitate to kill again, especially if they believe their secret is threatened. He moved to his desk and took out a sheet of his personal stationery. You will write to this Lady Pemberton, mon ami. You will say that you have recently returned from South America, where you had the pleasure of meeting a charming young lady who is now her guest. By a fortunate coincidence, your friend Hercule Poirot happens to be available to accompany you on a visit to the country. You will phrase it as a social call, but you will make it clear that my reputation precedes me. You think they'll see through it? Undoubtedly, Poirot said cheerfully. But what can they do? To refuse would be to appear suspicious. To accept is to invite the wolf into the henhouse. Either way, we learn something valuable. He paused at the door, his expression growing serious. But remember, Hastings, where there is one suspicious death, there may soon be another. If this Esperanza is correct, if she has indeed stumbled upon murder, then she is in grave danger. Time, it is not on our side. As he left to prepare for the journey, I remained at the table, staring at the letter. The girl from Buenos Aires, after all these years, reaching out across an ocean for help. And perhaps, I thought with a chill, reaching out just in time. For something told me that at Greystone Manor, death had not yet finished its work. The afternoon train to Surrey carried us through countryside already touched by autumn's melancholy, the golden leaves swirling past our compartment window like scattered memories. Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, occasionally murmuring observations about the geometric imperfection of the telegraph poles or the illogical placement of farmhouses. I had learned not to interrupt these meditative moments. His little grey cells were already at work, preparing for what lay ahead. "You observe, Hastings," he said suddenly as we approached our destination, "how quickly Lady Pemberton responded to our request. The telegram arrived within hours of our letter. Either she's remarkably efficient or remarkably eager to control the circumstances of our visit." Greystone Halt proved to be little more than a platform and a waiting room, but a gleaming motor car stood ready, driven by a chauffeur whose stolid face revealed nothing of his thoughts. The drive to the manor wound through an avenue of elms, their bare branches interlacing overhead like the ribs of some great cathedral, until Greystone Manor itself emerged from the gathering dusk, a long, severe house of weathered grey stone that seemed to brood over its parkland with the watchful patience of a predator. "It has the air of a mausoleum," Poirot murmured, adjusting his hat as we drew to a halt. "A house that keeps its secrets well and perhaps guards them too jealously." The great door was opened by a butler of such advanced age and dignified bearing that he might have been part of the original furnishings. He received our names with the grave courtesy of one announcing the arrival of mourners at a funeral, then ushered us into a drawing-room where a fire struggled against the encroaching chill of the October evening. Lady Pemberton awaited us there, and I understood immediately why Esperanza might feel intimidated. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 55, with silver hair swept back from a high, aristocratic forehead and pale blue eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything they encountered. Her mourning dress was of the finest black silk, and she wore it with the unconscious authority of one born to command. "Captain Hastings," she said, extending a perfectly gloved hand. "How good of you to come at such a difficult time. And Monsieur Poirot, your reputation precedes you, of course. Though I confess I'm rather surprised that our little Esperanza has such distinguished connections." The emphasis on little was subtle but unmistakable, reducing the 22-year-old woman to something childish and inconsequential. "Lady Pemberton," I replied, following our rehearsed script. "When I learned that Mademoiselle Valdez was visiting England, I thought it would be pleasant to renew an old acquaintance from my time in Buenos Aires." "How charming," she murmured, though her expression suggested she found it anything but. "Though you've chosen a rather tragic time for your visit. We've had a dreadful accident here. My stepson Charles fell from the library balcony just 2 days ago." Before I could respond, the door opened to admit a tall, lean man of about 40, dressed in country tweeds and carrying himself with the unconscious arrogance of inherited privilege. His grey eyes assessed us with barely concealed suspicion. "Geoffrey," Lady Pemberton said smoothly, "come and meet our guests. My nephew, Sir Geoffrey Ashford. Geoffrey, this is Captain Hastings and Monsieur Hercule Poirot." Sir Geoffrey's handshake was perfunctory, his gaze calculating. "Poirot, the detective fellow. Rather convenient timing for a social call, wouldn't you say? Girl arrives from Argentina, Charles dies, and suddenly famous detectives appear on our doorstep." At that moment, Esperanza herself entered, and my heart constricted with sympathy. The vivacious girl I remembered from Buenos Aires had been replaced by a pale, anxious young woman whose dark eyes darted nervously about the room. When she saw me, however, her face brightened with genuine relief. "Captain Hastings? Monsieur Poirot, you came." Poirot bowed with his characteristic continental courtesy. "Mademoiselle, we could hardly refuse such an eloquent invitation." His eyes, however, were already cataloguing every detail of the room, every nuance of expression on the faces around us. "The accident," he continued, turning back to Lady Pemberton. "It was witnessed?" "No one was present," she replied firmly. "Charles was alone in the library. Dr. Arbuthnot confirmed he'd been suffering from dizzy spells. The coroner ruled it accidental death immediately." Yet Mademoiselle Valdez mentioned that she heard a cry, Poirot observed gently. The silence that followed was electric. Sir Geoffrey's jaw tightened, Lady Pemberton's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and Esperanza shrank back as if she had committed some terrible social error. "The poor child has been quite overwrought," Lady Pemberton said finally. "Foreign nerves, you understand. So sensitive to tragedy." Poirot's smile was bland, but I recognized the dangerous glitter in his green eyes. The game, as he would say, was afoot. Dinner at Greystone Manor was served with the precision of a military operation, though the atmosphere suggested we were dining in a mausoleum rather than a country house. The long mahogany table reflected the flickering candlelight like a dark mirror, and I found myself studying the faces around it with growing unease. Lady Pemberton presided with icy composure, while Sir Geoffrey attacked his roast beef with the savage intensity of a man working through his frustrations with a knife and fork. We had been joined by Dr. Arbuthnot, the family physician who had examined Charles Pemberton's body. He was a florid man of 50 with trembling hands and the nervous laugh of someone desperately trying to appear at ease. His deference to Lady Pemberton bordered on servility, a fact that did not escape Poirot's sharp observation. "Such a tragic accident," Arbuthnot repeated for the third time, dabbing at his forehead with his napkin. But Charles was always constitutionally delicate, suffered terribly from vertigo. "How curious," Poirot murmured, precisely cutting his meat into geometric squares. Mademoiselle Valdez described him as quite vigorous, a man who enjoyed riding and hunting. The doctor's wine-glass paused halfway to his lips. "Appearances can be deceiving, Monsieur Poirot. The inner ear, vertigo, strikes without warning. I had warned him repeatedly about heights." "You treated him often for this condition?" "Well, not formally," Arbuthnot stammered, his face flushing. "Charles disliked medical interference, but Lady Pemberton mentioned his dizzy spells, and I prescribed tonics." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "So you diagnosed him based entirely on hearsay?" Before the flustered doctor could respond, a young man entered and took his place at the table with apologetic murmurs. This was Philip Cardew, Charles Pemberton's private secretary. A earnest fellow of perhaps 28, with the anxious manner of one whose livelihood depended entirely on pleasing his betters. "Forgive my lateness," he said, his voice catching slightly. I was going through Mr. Charles' correspondence. Even now, I cannot believe he's gone." "You worked closely with him?" Poirot inquired gently. "For 3 years, sir. He was very good to me. On the day he died, I was in the village posting letters. Mrs. Jenkins at the tea shop can confirm it. When I returned," he swallowed hard, "the household was in chaos." Esperanza, who had remained silent throughout the meal, suddenly looked up from her barely touched plate. "Charles spoke to me that morning," she said quietly, her accent more pronounced under stress. "He seemed frightened. He told me to be careful, to trust no one in this house." The words fell like stones into still water. Sir Geoffrey's fork clattered against his plate. Dr. Arbuthnot made a choking sound, and even Lady Pemberton's marble composure cracked slightly. "Really, my dear," she said coolly, "you mustn't dramatize every casual conversation. Charles was under considerable stress with the estate business." "Perhaps," Poirot said, rising from his chair with deliberate ceremony, "we might examine the scene of this unfortunate accident. It would help me to visualize the circumstances." Lady Pemberton's hesitation lasted barely a heartbeat. "If you insist, Geoffrey, show them to the library." The library was a vast, shadowy room lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and secrets. Heavy curtains had been drawn back from the French doors leading to the stone balcony where Charles Pemberton had met his death. Poirot moved immediately to the balustrade, running his hands along the weathered stone with scientific precision. "Waist high on a tall man," he murmured. "To fall accidentally, one would need to lean far over. Most dangerous." He turned back to the watching group. You say he was reaching for a book? Yes, Lady Pemberton replied, gesturing toward shelves near the balcony doors. A volume on local land disputes. The ladder was found overturned beside his body. And the book itself? Surrey Land Enclosures, 1750-1800 tolls, Sir Geoffrey said. I found it on the balcony floor and returned it to its proper place. Poirot moved to the shelves with the focused intensity of a hunting cat. His eyes scanned the leather spines rapidly until he stopped, pointing with one precise finger. Ah, here is the gap where the book belongs. He paused, his green eyes suddenly dangerous. But how very curious. This shelf is barely 2 feet from the floor. To retrieve a book from here, one kneels, Hastings. One does not require a ladder, and if one is kneeling beside these shelves, one cannot possibly fall over a balustrade that stands 3 feet away. The silence that crashed into the room was absolute. Dr. Arbuthnot had gone white as paper, Sir Geoffrey's face was ashen, and even Lady Pemberton's composure finally cracked. I think, Poirot said softly, his voice cutting through the stunned quiet like a blade, that Charles Pemberton was murdered. And I think everyone in this room knows it. The accusation hung in the library air like incense in a cathedral, heavy, inescapable, and somehow sanctifying the space for the ritual of truth that was to follow. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Sir Geoffrey erupted with the volcanic fury of a man whose world has been turned upside down. Damn your impertinence, Poirot. You waltz into this house and within hours accuse us of murder. Have you no decency, no respect for a family in mourning? Poirot regarded him with the serene patience of a confessor listening to a familiar litany of sins. I have accused no one of anything, Sir Geoffrey. I have merely observed that the physical evidence does not support the theory of accidental death. The book was on the wrong shelf. The ladder was unnecessary for reaching it. These are facts, not accusations. Lady Pemberton had recovered her composure with the swift efficiency of a general regrouping after an unexpected assault. 2 spots of color burned high on her aristocratic cheekbones, but her voice remained level. Monsieur Poirot, you forget yourself. The coroner has ruled on this matter. If you persist in these theatrical fantasies, I shall be compelled to ask you to leave. But naturally, madame, it is your house, Poirot replied with a courteous bow, though I wonder how you will explain to the authorities why you expelled a detective who was investigating circumstances that clearly trouble your own house guest. His glance toward Esperanza was meaningful, and I saw her straighten slightly, drawing strength from his implicit support. Dr. Arbuthnot cleared his throat with the nervous rasp of a man whose professional reputation had been called into question. Perhaps there's a simple explanation. Charles might have moved the book himself, placed it incorrectly. In his distracted state, with the vertigo affecting his judgment. You persist in this diagnosis of vertigo, Poirot interrupted gently, yet you have admitted you never formally examined him for this condition. Tell me, doctor, who suggested to you that Charles Pemberton suffered from dizzy spells? The silence that followed was electric. Arbuthnot's eyes darted to Lady Pemberton, then away. The family mentioned, it seemed consistent with the circumstances. Ah, Poirot murmured. The family mentioned. How convenient for the family that such a condition should be remembered after the death, when it could no longer be verified by the patient himself. Esperanza stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. Please, Lady Pemberton, if Monsieur Poirot can discover what really happened to Charles, we must let him try. Charles was kind to me. He was the only one in this house who made me feel welcome. Something flickered across Lady Pemberton's face. Guilt, perhaps, or merely irritation at having her authority challenged by a foreign girl barely out of her teens. My dear child, you don't understand what you're asking. If Monsieur Poirot continues down this path, he will drag our family name through the newspapers. The scandal, the gossip. Better scandal than murder going unpunished, I interjected. unable to remain silent any longer. Lady Pemberton's eyes fixed on me with arctic coldness. "Captain Hastings, you forget yourself. This is not some sensational novel. This is a respectable English family in which a man has died under highly suspicious circumstances," Poirot finished quietly, "and in which a young woman fears for her life. These are not the hallmarks of respectability, madam. They are the hallmarks of something far more dangerous." He moved to the center of the room, his small figure somehow commanding despite its lack of physical presence. "I propose a compromise. Grant me 3 days to investigate quietly, with discretion. If at the end of that time I found nothing conclusive, I will depart and trouble you no more. But if I do find evidence of murder—" He paused, his green eyes sweeping across each face in turn. "Then justice must be served, regardless of inconvenience to anyone." Lady Pemberton's jaw tightened, but after a long moment she inclined her head with icy dignity. 3 days, Monsieur Poirot. But you will conduct yourself with absolute discretion. No wild theories, no disturbing the servants unnecessarily." "Hercule Poirot is always the soul of discretion," he replied smoothly. "Now, if I may suggest, I should like to speak with each member of the household privately. Perhaps we might use the morning room. Treadwell can ensure we are not interrupted." The morning room proved to be a smaller, more intimate chamber, overlooking the estate's famous yew maze. Poirot arranged 3 chairs with mathematical precision, positioning himself to face both his interview subject and the door. "We begin with Lady Pemberton," he murmured to me. "Always, one starts with the person who believes herself to be in command." She entered with the bearing of a queen granting audience to troublesome subjects, every line of her body proclaiming control. Poirot rose, bowed, and indicated the chair opposite him. "Madame, you loved your stepson?" he asked without preamble. The directness of the question clearly startled her. "I considered it my duty to provide Charles with every advantage." "Love is a sentimental word, Monsieur Poirot. Duty without affection is thin nourishment for a young man," Poirot observed. "Tell me of his character." "He was impulsive," she said carefully, selecting each word like a jeweler choosing stones. "Too easily influenced by others? My late husband left him an income entirely disproportionate to his judgment." "He had debts?" A pause, almost imperceptible but not quite quick enough to escape Poirot's notice. "Some. Nothing beyond what a gentleman of his position might be expected to carry." "And the estate itself?" "Grey stone is entailed upon Geoffrey, naturally. Charles had his London flat and various investments. His death changes nothing material here, except perhaps the distribution of certain securities," Poirot said softly. "There are often multiple forms of property, are there not, madame?" She rose abruptly, her silk skirts rustling with indignation. "If you wish to know about finances, speak to Mr. Cardew. He handled Charles's affairs. I will not have my family loyalty questioned by a stranger." When she had swept from the room, I turned to Poirot. "You pressed her rather hard. But of course, mon ami, she has a strong intelligence. One must strike while the metal is hot. Now, the nephew." Sir Geoffrey entered with studied nonchalance that didn't quite conceal his underlying tension. He flung himself into the chair with careless defiance, crossing one leg over the other in a pose of masculine indifference. "Well, Poirot, had your little chat with my aunt, she swallowing your theories about murder?" "We discussed only possibilities, Sir Geoffrey," Poirot replied pleasantly. "Tell me, your relations with your cousin were cordial?" Geoffrey snorted. "We tolerated each other well enough. Charles was a bit of a fool, but harmless. The sort who's easily led by the nose, particularly by women." "By women?" Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "He was completely infatuated with that Argentine girl," Geoffrey said bluntly, "mooning about her like a schoolboy, talking of marriage. Quite ridiculous, really." I felt a shock of surprise. Esperanza's letter had mentioned no romantic attachment. You disapproved of such a match? Naturally. Foreign adventuress appears with a convenient inheritance, and poor Charles loses what little sense he had. We've seen it all before. Your aunt shared these views? She'd have cut him off without a penny, Geoffrey said grimly. Greystone means everything to her. She wasn't about to see it entangled with some South American nobody and her dubious connections. Yet, as you mentioned earlier, Greystone passes to you, not to Charles, Poirot observed mildly, so his marriage would not have affected your inheritance. Geoffrey's eyes hardened. Are you suggesting I had something to gain from his death? I suggest nothing. I arrange facts, that is all. You had words with him recently? We quarreled the night before he died, Geoffrey admitted reluctantly. Family temper. It meant nothing. On the contrary, Poirot murmured after Geoffrey had left. It may mean everything. Now, Hastings, we must speak with the secretary. Philip Cardew entered hesitantly, clutching a leather portfolio like a shield. He perched on the edge of his chair, fair hair disheveled, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. I had the impression of a man perpetually braced for disaster. Monsieur Cardew, Poirot began gently, you managed all of Mr. Pemberton's business affairs. Yes, sir. Investments, correspondence, tenant matters, everything of that nature. Mr. Charles relied on me completely. And did others perhaps seek information about Mr. Charles through you? Family members, for instance? Cardew hesitated, his loyalty warring with his fear. Lady Pemberton occasionally asked about general matters. Sir Geoffrey was more direct. He wanted to know exactly how much Charles owed and to whom. Poirot leaned forward slightly. The amount was substantial. I shouldn't really, Cardew began, then seemed to collapse inwardly. Between us, Mr. Charles owed nearly £20,000. There was talk of liquidating some South American investments that had recently come into the family through Miss Valdez's inheritance. The legal arrangements were complex, but Mr. Charles believed marriage would simplify the trustee situation considerably. I exchanged a significant glance with Poirot. Here was motive with a vengeance. Love and money intertwined in the deadliest of combinations. One final question, Poirot said. Mr. Pemberton's will, had he made recent changes? He was planning to visit his solicitor in London next week, Cardew said quietly. He mentioned needing to make significant revisions to his testament. After Cardew had left, Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening maze. From his pocket, he withdrew a small envelope and shook out its contents, a distinctive leather-covered button of the type used on gentlemen's shooting jackets. Good God, I breathed. Where did you find that? Caught in the stonework of the library balcony, Poirot said, examining it with his magnifying glass. Overlooked in the cleaning that undoubtedly followed the accident. It does not match the clothing Charles Pemberton was wearing when he died. Then it belongs to his killer. Perhaps, Poirot said thoughtfully. Or perhaps to someone who wishes us to believe it belongs to the killer. In this house, Hastings, we must trust nothing but logic and careful observation. He returned the button to its envelope with ceremonial care. But one thing is certain. We now have physical evidence that someone else was present during Charles Pemberton's final moments. Tomorrow, we shall discover who in this household owns such a jacket, and then, mon ami, the net begins to close. As we prepared to retire, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the dark corridors of Greystone Manor, a murderer was planning their next move. The game, as Poirot would say, was truly afoot. The grey mist that shrouded Greystone Manor the following morning seemed to press against the windows like curious fingers, as if the very air sought to penetrate the secrets within. I found Poirot already at breakfast, examining his soft-boiled egg with the satisfaction of a man whose universe had momentarily aligned with his expectations. "Today, Hastings," he announced, tapping the perfect shell with ceremonial precision. "We must excavate the truth from beneath layers of careful deception. The button tells us someone else was present during Charles Pemberton's final moments, but buttons can be planted as easily as flowers. We must dig deeper. His opportunity came when Esperanza appeared in the conservatory, tending to the orchids with the mechanical movements of someone seeking refuge from fear. When Poirot suggested a walk in the estate's famous yew maze, relief flooded her face. She fetched a shawl and joined us without hesitation, glancing nervously over her shoulder as we descended the terrace steps. The maze proved to be the perfect sanctuary for confidences. Its ancient walls, thick and impenetrable, created a world apart from the watching eyes of Greystone Manor. Poirot led us to its heart, where a stone bench sat beneath a weathered sundial. Only when he was satisfied we were truly alone did he speak. "Mademoiselle, you must tell us everything," he said gently but firmly. "Not the careful version you wrote in your letter, but the complete truth. Your life may depend upon absolute honesty." Esperanza's hands twisted in her lap, her dark eyes filling with tears she had held back too long. "I've been so frightened, monsieur. Charles was kind to me when no one else was. He understood what it was to be alone in a strange place. We would talk in the evenings after dinner, when the others had withdrawn. He told me things, terrible things about his family." "What things?" Poirot prompted, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a confessor. "He said his family was not what it appeared, that beneath the respectability there were secrets, dangerous secrets. He spoke of his father's death 5 years ago, how it had been ruled a riding accident, but Charles had always suspected otherwise." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. His father had been about to change his will, to leave Charles control of certain trust funds that Lady Pemberton had been managing. Then the accident happened, and everything remained as it was. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. He believed his stepmother murdered his father? "He had no proof," Esperanza said quickly. "Only suspicions. But 3 weeks ago, when my solicitors informed me of my inheritance, Charles became very interested in the legal arrangements. My aunt had invested heavily in Argentine railways and mining concerns, the same investments Charles' father had made before his death. Charles began researching the companies, going through old papers in the library. That was when he became truly frightened." Poirot leaned forward, his green eyes intent. "What did he discover?" "He would not tell me specifics. He said it was safer if I didn't know. But 2 days before he died, he gave me this." She reached into her bodice and withdrew a small brass key, its surface worn smooth by handling. "He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone I trusted. It opens a drawer in his desk at the London flat. He said the papers there would prove everything." Poirot took the key with the reverence of one receiving a sacred relic, turning it over in his palm as if it... The grey mist that shrouded Greystone Manor the following morning seemed to press against the windows like curious fingers, as if the very air sought to penetrate the secrets within. I found Poirot already at breakfast, examining his soft-boiled egg with the satisfaction of a man whose universe had momentarily aligned with his expectations. "Today, Hastings," he announced, tapping the perfect shell with ceremonial precision, "we must excavate the truth from beneath layers of careful deception. The button tells us someone else was present during Charles Pemberton's final moments, but buttons can be planted as easily as flowers. We must dig deeper." His opportunity came when Esperanza appeared in the conservatory, tending to the orchids with the mechanical movements of someone seeking refuge from fear. When Poirot suggested a walk in the estate's famous yew maze, relief flooded her face. She fetched a shawl and joined us without hesitation, glancing nervously over her shoulder as we descended the terrace steps. The maze proved to be the perfect sanctuary for confidences. Its ancient walls, thick and impenetrable, created a world apart from the watching eyes of Greystone Manor. Poirot led us to its heart, where a stone bench sat beneath a weathered sundial. Only when he was satisfied we were truly alone did he speak. "Mademoiselle, you must tell us everything." he said gently but firmly. Not the careful version you wrote in your letter, but the complete truth. Your life may depend upon absolute honesty. Esperanza's hands twisted in her lap, her dark eyes filling with tears she had held back too long. I've been so frightened, monsieur. Charles was kind to me when no one else was. He understood what it was to be alone in a strange place. We would talk in the evenings after dinner, when the others had withdrawn. He told me things, terrible things about his family. What things? Poirot prompted, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a confessor. He said his family was not what it appeared, that beneath the respectability there were secrets, dangerous secrets. He spoke of his father's death 5 years ago, how it had been ruled a riding accident, but Charles had always suspected otherwise. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. His father had been about to change his will, to leave Charles control of certain trust funds that Lady Pemberton had been managing. Then the accident happened, and everything remained as it was. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. He believed his stepmother murdered his father. He had no proof, Esperanza said quickly. Only suspicions. But 3 weeks ago, when my solicitors informed me of my inheritance, Charles became very interested in the legal arrangements. My aunt had invested heavily in Argentine railways and mining concerns, the same investments Charles' father had made before his death. Charles began researching the companies, going through old papers in the library. That was when he became truly frightened. Poirot leaned forward, his green eyes intent. What did he discover? He would not tell me specifics. He said it was safer if I didn't know, but 2 days before he died, he gave me this. She reached into her bodice and withdrew a small brass key, its surface worn smooth by handling. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone I trusted. It opens a drawer in his desk at the London flat. He said the papers there would prove everything. Poirot took the key with the reverence of one receiving a sacred relic, turning it over in his palm as if weighing its significance. You told no one about this key? No one, she replied firmly. I've slept with it under my pillow every night since his death. Wise, Poirot murmured. This changes everything, mademoiselle. This transforms vague suspicion into tangible proof. But now your danger increases tenfold if the murderer suspects you possess this. We returned to the house in thoughtful silence, the key safely secured in Poirot's waistcoat pocket. The atmosphere at luncheon was electric with unspoken tensions. Lady Pemberton's pale eyes followed our every movement, while Sir Geoffrey attacked his roast beef with savage intensity. Dr. Arbuthnot's hands trembled more than usual as he reached for his wine glass. After the meal, Lady Pemberton cornered us in the morning room, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. Monsieur Poirot, she began, her voice controlled but vibrating with suppressed alarm, I've received a most disturbing telephone call from Charles's solicitor in London. It seems certain family documents cannot be accessed because a key to his private papers has gone missing. Poirot's expression remained perfectly bland. Indeed, madame. Most unfortunate. The solicitor implies theft, she continued, her eyes boring into his. Given that you've been closeted with our Argentine guest, speaking of murder and conspiracies, you'll understand my concern. Your concern does you credit, Poirot replied smoothly. Allow me to relieve your anxiety. He withdrew the brass key and placed it deliberately on the polished table between them. Lady Pemberton stared at it as if it were a serpent. Charles entrusted this to the one person in this house who had no motive for his death, Poirot said quietly. Tomorrow we travel to London to examine what he considered too dangerous to keep at Greystone Manor. Lady Pemberton's face went ashen. You cannot take that girl gallivanting about London without discovering the truth? Poirot interrupted, his voice suddenly steel-hard. Madame, I shall do whatever is necessary to protect an innocent young woman and expose a murderer. The inconvenience to your household is regrettable, but irrelevant. As we prepared to leave the room, Treadwell appeared with his usual ghostly silence. "Excuse me, sir," he addressed Poirot with unusual urgency. "There's been a development. The constable from the village wishes to speak with you immediately. It concerns Mr. Cardew, sir. It seems he's disappeared and his rooms have been ransacked." The village constable proved to be a stout, red-faced man named Perkins, whose country manner concealed a shrewdness that Poirot immediately recognized and respected. He stood in the entrance hall, turning his helmet awkwardly in his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the grandeur of his surroundings, but determined to do his duty. "Found his room in a terrible state, Mr. Poirot," he reported, his Somerset accent thick as cream. "Mrs. Jenkins from the village tea shop says she saw Mr. Cardew walking toward the London road early this morning, carrying a small valise and looking frightened as a rabbit with hounds on its tail." Poirot's eyes narrowed with calculation. "The time, constable?" "Just after dawn, sir. She was opening her shop and noticed, because it was unusual, Mr. Cardew being such a creature of habit and all." "Show us the room immediately," Poirot commanded, already moving toward the stairs with the purposeful stride of a general advancing on enemy territory. Cardew's quarters occupied a modest suite in the east wing, far from the family apartments, a deliberate placement that spoke volumes about his status in the household hierarchy. The destruction was methodical rather than frenzied. Every drawer had been pulled out and emptied, books swept from shelves, papers scattered across the carpet like fallen leaves. Yet as Poirot moved through the chaos with the delicate steps of a cat navigating broken glass, his trained eye discerned a pattern. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, kneeling beside the overturned writing desk. "This is not the work of a panicked thief. The papers have been examined, then rejected. Someone searched with purpose, looking for something specific." He produced a small magnifying glass and examined the lock of the desk drawer, which had been forced with brutal efficiency. Amateur work, but effective. This was done while we were at luncheon, when the household was occupied. Moving to the fireplace, Poirot extracted several charred fragments from the grate with tweezers he produced from his waistcoat pocket. The largest piece bore tantalizing fragments. "Railway shares transferred. Lady P. Unauthorized transactions. The South American investments," I breathed, recognizing the connection immediately. "Precisely, mon ami. Mr. Cardew knew something dangerous about the family finances. But observe this." He moved to the bed, where the mattress had been slashed open, and retrieved a small object from beneath the frame. "A collar stud, but not Mr. Cardew's. Here's a silver with mother of pearl, as I observed yesterday. This is brass, the type worn by servants." The implication struck me like a physical blow. Someone from below stairs was involved. Or someone wished us to think so. Poirot replied grimly, "In this house, we must trust nothing at face value." Our investigation was interrupted by Lady Pemberton's entrance, her composure intact, but her pale eyes betraying a flicker of genuine alarm. "Monsieur Poirot, this situation has become intolerable. First, these wild theories about Charles's death. Now our secretary has apparently absconded with sensitive documents. I insist you cease these disruptive inquiries immediately." Poirot rose slowly, his green eyes fixing on her with laser intensity. But madam, I think you are more concerned about what Mr. Cardew might reveal than what he might have stolen. Tell me about the Argentine railway shares, the ones transferred to your personal control 3 months after your husband's death, despite his will specifying they should pass to Charles." The color drained from Lady Pemberton's face as if a valve had been opened. "How dare you? Those are private family matters." "Murder makes all matters public," Poirot interrupted, his voice steel-hard beneath its courteous surface. "Charles discovered this irregularity, did he not? And when Miss Valdez arrived with her inheritance, invested in the same concerns, he realized the pattern. Your husband had been investigating fraud in those companies before his convenient riding accident." Lady Pemberton's hands trembled as she gripped the back of a chair. You will leave this house immediately. I will not tolerate such monstrous accusations." "I think not, madame. For you see, the game has changed. Someone grows desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." As if summoned by his words, a piercing scream echoed from the floor above, Esperanza's voice, raw with terror. We rushed upstairs to find her standing frozen in her bedroom doorway, pointing with a shaking hand at her bed. There, on her pillow, lay a single black rose, its petals already wilting, and beside it a note in crude block letters, "Go home or join Charles." Poirot examined the macabre gift without touching it, his face grave. "The killer grows desperate," he murmured. "They searched Cardew's room for the key, not knowing we already possess it. Now they threaten openly, which means they feel cornered." He turned to address the household members who had gathered at the commotion. Lady Pemberton, Sir Geoffrey, Dr. Arbuthnot, and several servants. A cornered animal is the most dangerous creature of all, but it is also the most likely to make fatal errors. His gaze settled on Esperanza, who had begun to weep quietly. "Mademoiselle, you will pack immediately. Tonight you sleep in the room adjoining mine, where Captain Hastings and I can ensure your safety. Tomorrow we depart for London at first light." "London?" Sir Geoffrey demanded. "What business have you in London?" Poirot's smile was razor-thin. "The business of truth, Sir Geoffrey. Mr. Charles Pemberton left certain documents in his London flat. Documents that will illuminate the shadows in which your family's secrets have hidden. The key to those documents is safe in my possession, and tomorrow we shall use it." As the household dispersed in uncomfortable silence, Poirot drew me aside. "The pace quickens, Hastings. First, Charles dies to prevent him from changing his will and exposing the railway fraud. Then Cardew disappears, or is made to disappear, because he knew too much about the financial arrangements. Now they threaten Miss Valdez directly. You think Cardew is dead? I think Mr. Cardew has become inconvenient to someone who has already killed once and will not hesitate to kill again. Whether he fled in terror or met Charles's fate, we may never know. But this, I promise you, tomorrow's journey to London will provide the answers we seek. The murderer has made their position clear with tonight's threat. Now we shall make ours clear with tomorrow's revelations." He paused at the window, gazing out at the darkened grounds where mist swirled like restless spirits around the ancient trees. "Sleep lightly tonight, mon ami, for I suspect that before dawn, someone in this house will attempt something desperate, and when they do, Hercule Poirot will be ready." Sleep proved elusive that night at Greystone Manor, the ancient house seeming to whisper secrets through its weathered timbers. I had positioned myself in the chair beside my door, fully dressed and alert, while Poirot maintained his vigil in the adjoining room. Esperanza slept fitfully in the chamber between us, her door left slightly ajar at Poirot's insistence. The attack came at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, announced by the softest scraping of metal against metal. Through my partially open door, I glimpsed a shadowy figure working at Esperanza's lock with what appeared to be a skeleton key. The intruder moved with practiced stealth, clearly familiar with the house's layout and the habits of its occupants. Before I could act, Poirot appeared in his doorway like a silk-clad spectre, his green eyes glittering with satisfaction rather than surprise. "Bonsoir," he said conversationally, as if greeting a dinner guest. Or should I say, bon matin? The hour makes social niceties somewhat ambiguous. The figure froze, then melted back into the shadows with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to clandestine movements. Footsteps retreated rapidly down the corridor, but Poirot made no move to pursue. "Let him go, Hastings," he murmured, sensing my intention to give chase. Fear is a slow poison. It works best when allowed to circulate through the system, creating doubt, suspicion, desperate measures. Esperanza appeared in her doorway, pale but determined. Who was it? Someone who grows increasingly desperate. Poirot replied, his voice carrying grim satisfaction. Someone who knows that tomorrow's journey to London may expose secrets that have been buried for 5 years. Dawn brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere. Lady Pemberton did not appear at breakfast, pleading indisposition, while Sir Geoffrey sat in brooding silence, his usual arrogance replaced by something approaching fear. Dr. Arbuthnot's hands trembled more violently than usual as he attempted to manage his coffee cup. The journey to London passed in tense silence, Esperanza seated between us like a precious cargo we dared not lose. Poirot seemed almost cheerful, humming tunelessly and occasionally remarking on the geometric imperfection of telegraph poles, but I recognized this as his manner when the little grey cells were working at their highest intensity. Charles Pemberton's flat in Kensington proved to be a gentleman's residence of tasteful understatement. Leather-bound books, silver-framed photographs, the accumulated possessions of a life cut tragically short. Poirot moved immediately to the mahogany desk in the study, producing the brass key with ceremonial precision. "Now, mes amis," he announced, "we shall discover what Mr. Charles considered worth dying for." The drawer yielded its secrets reluctantly. Inside lay a leather portfolio bound with black ribbon, and beneath it several loose documents that made Poirot's eyebrows rise with interest. As he examined each paper, his expression grew increasingly grave. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, spreading the documents across the desk surface. "Here we have correspondence with a private investigator regarding certain irregularities in the Argentine railway investments. And here," he held up a carbon copy of a letter. Charles's father wrote to his solicitor 2 days before his riding accident, expressing fears for his life and detailing his wife's unauthorized management of trust funds. "Good God," I breathed. He suspected she would kill him? More than suspected. He had proof of embezzlement, fraud, and worse. But observe this final document. Poirot lifted a sealed envelope marked in Charles's bold handwriting, "To be opened only in the event of my death." Before he could break the seal, the telephone on the desk rang with jarring shrillness. Poirot lifted the receiver cautiously, his expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as he listened. "When did this occur? I see. His condition? And he was able to speak? Excellent. We return immediately." He replaced the receiver with deliberate care, his face pale but determined. "That was Inspector Japp from Scotland Yard. They have found Philip Cardew, alive, but barely. He was discovered unconscious near the railway station, severely beaten. Before losing consciousness at the hospital, he managed to whisper one crucial word. Button." Esperanza gasped. "The button you found on the balcony?" "Precisely, mademoiselle. Mr. Cardew witnessed Charles' murder and recognized the significance of that small piece of evidence. Someone discovered his knowledge and attempted to silence him permanently." I felt a chill of understanding. "Then the murderer knows we're closing in." "Indeed, Hastings. Which makes our return to Greystone Manor both urgent and dangerous. The killer believes they have eliminated the only witness, but in their desperation, they have provided us with the final piece of evidence we require. The return journey was a blur of speed and mounting tension." Poirot sat in brooding silence, the unopened envelope from Charles's desk secured in his waistcoat pocket like a talisman. As Greystone Manor emerged from the gathering dusk, its windows glowing like watching eyes, I felt we were approaching not just the scene of our investigation, but the climax of a deadly game that had begun 5 years earlier with the death of Charles' father. The household awaited us in the drawing room, summoned by Poirot's telegraphed instructions. The atmosphere was electric with fear and barely suppressed hostility. Lady Pemberton sat rigid in her chair, her pale eyes fixed on Poirot with undisguised hatred. Sir Geoffrey paced before the fireplace like a caged predator, while Dr. Arbuthnot appeared on the verge of complete collapse. "This is intolerable," Lady Pemberton began as we entered, "summoning us like common servants." "Silence, madame," Poirot interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. We are past the time for social niceties. Murder has been done, and tonight, justice will finally be served. He moved to the center of the room, a small figure radiating immense power. In his hand, he held Charles's final letter, its seal still unbroken. "Before we proceed," he announced, "I think it appropriate that we allow the dead man to speak. Mr. Charles Pemberton left instructions that this letter be opened only in the event of his death. That event, sadly, has occurred." As he broke the seal with deliberate ceremony, the silence in the room became absolute. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if the flames themselves were holding their breath. "Now," Poirot said, unfolding the single sheet of paper, "let us hear what Charles Pemberton knew about the person who murdered him." The game, as he would say, had reached its final, deadly phase. Poirot held the letter with the reverence of a priest handling sacred scripture, his green eyes scanning the contents before addressing the assembled company. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the nervous ticking of the mantelpiece clock and Dr. Arbuthnot's labored breathing. "This letter," Poirot began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial pronouncement, "was written by Charles Pemberton 2 days before his death. He entrusted it to his solicitor with specific instructions that it be opened only in the event of his demise." He paused, allowing the implications to settle like dust in still air. "Let me read the relevant portions." The paper rustled softly as Poirot adjusted his spectacles with theatrical precision. Charles Pemberton's voice seemed to echo from beyond the grave as Poirot read aloud. "If this letter reaches you, it means my fears have been realized, and I am dead. Not by accident, but by design. For 5 years, I've harbored suspicions about my father's riding accident. Recently, those suspicions have crystallized into terrible certainty. I have discovered systematic embezzlement from the South American railway investments that formed the cornerstone of our family trust. My father uncovered this same fraud 5 years ago and threatened to expose it. 2 days later, he was found dead in a ditch with a broken neck. The coroner ruled it accidental death, but I now possess evidence that his saddle girth was deliberately weakened. The same pattern is repeating itself with Miss Valdez's inheritance. Her late aunt's investments in Argentine railways mirror our own holdings exactly. The same fraudulent companies, the same systematic drainage of funds into private accounts. When she arrived in England, I saw my opportunity to finally expose the truth. The person responsible has killed once to protect their secret. They will not hesitate to kill again. If I die before completing my investigation, know that the murderer is someone who had access to both my father's stable and the family financial records. Someone who could arrange medical testimony to support accidental death, and someone who stands to lose everything if the truth emerges. I have hidden copies of the most damaging evidence in my London flat. The key is with the one person in this house I trust completely. Miss Valdez herself. Charles Pemberton. The letter's conclusion struck the room like a physical blow. Lady Pemberton's marble composure finally cracked, 2 spots of colour burning high on her aristocratic cheekbones. Sir Geoffrey had gone ashen, his hands gripping the mantelpiece until his knuckles showed white. Dr. Arbuthnot appeared on the verge of complete collapse, his teacup rattling against its saucer like castanets. "Observe," Poirot said softly, folding the letter with ceremonial care, "how Charles was clever enough not to name his killer directly. He understood that direct accusations might endanger others. Instead, he provided us with the criteria by which to identify the murderer." He began to pace slowly, his movements precise and deliberate. "Someone with access to the stable. That eliminates the servants, who are forbidden from the family quarters. Someone with access to financial records. That requires intimate knowledge of family business. Someone who could arrange false medical testimony. That suggests influence over the family physician." Dr. Arbuthnot let out a strangled sound. The medical reports were... I thought it was merely to protect the family reputation after an unfortunate accident." "Ah," Poirot murmured, his eyebrows rising with interest. "So you admit to falsifying medical records, Doctor? First for Charles's father, claiming he suffered from dizzy spells that made riding dangerous. Then for Charles himself, inventing a convenient case of vertigo to explain his fall from the library balcony. Lady Pemberton asked me to—" Arbuthnot began desperately, then stopped, horror dawning in his eyes at what he had almost revealed. "She asked you to what, Doctor?" Poirot pressed gently, but with the inexorable force of a glacier. "To provide medical cover for murder, to sign death certificates without proper examination, to become an accessory to not one but two killings?" Lady Pemberton rose from her chair with terrible dignity, her pale eyes blazing with defiance. "You prove nothing with your theatrical accusations, Monsieur Poirot. The word of a hysterical foreign girl and a cowardly secretary against the reputation of an ancient English family. No court in England would convict on such flimsy evidence." "Ah, but madame," Poirot replied with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, "we have more than words. We have this." From his waistcoat pocket, he produced the leather button we had found on the library balcony, holding it up to catch the firelight. A button torn from the killer's jacket during the struggle that preceded Charles's death. Sir Geoffrey's face had gone white as parchment. "That proves nothing. Half the men in England wear similar shooting jackets." "But not jackets made by huntsmen of Savile Row, Sir Geoffrey," Poirot countered smoothly. "Observe the distinctive brass finish, the particular leather covering. This comes from a shooting jacket, commissioned specifically for the Greystone estate. The estate records show that only 3 such jackets were ever made. One for Charles' father, buried with him 5 years ago. One for Charles himself, which hangs intact in his wardrobe, and one that has mysteriously disappeared from this house." The accusation hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Sir Geoffrey's jaw worked soundlessly, his hands opening and closing in futile gestures. "You see," Poirot continued relentlessly, "Mr. Cardew witnessed more than we initially realized. He saw someone leaving the library immediately after Charles's death, someone wearing a torn shooting jacket, someone he recognized. That is why he fled in terror. That is why he was attacked and left for dead." "But Cardew is alive," I interjected, understanding beginning to dawn. "Indeed, Hastings. And before losing consciousness at the hospital, he managed to whisper one crucial word to Inspector Japp." Poirot's eyes swept across the assembled faces like a lighthouse beam seeking ships in distress. He identified his attacker. He named the person who pushed Charles Pemberton to his death. As if summoned by his words, the drawing-room door opened to admit Inspector Japp, his solid presence bringing with it the authority of Scotland Yard. His sharp eyes took in the assembled company with professional interest before settling on Poirot. "Sorry to interrupt the family gathering," Japp said grimly, "but I have that statement from Cardew you wanted. Clear as day once the doctors got him patched up. Saw everything from the servants' staircase that night, the struggle on the balcony, the fall, and most importantly, the face of the person who pushed Mr. Charles to his death." Lady Pemberton's composure finally shattered completely. "This is intolerable. I will not stand here and be accused by servants and foreigners of murder, madame," Poirot finished quietly. "For that is what we are discussing. Not mere embezzlement, not simple fraud, but cold-blooded murder. Twice committed, and nearly a 3rd time with poor Cardew." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Every eye in the room was fixed on Poirot, waiting for the final revelation that would unmask the killer and bring justice for Charles Pemberton's death. "Tomorrow morning," Poirot announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "I shall reveal the complete solution to this tragic affair. By then, the last pieces of evidence will have been verified, and the murderer will have no choice but to face the consequences of their actions." He moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the brass handle. "I suggest you all spend tonight in reflection, mes amis. For tomorrow, the truth will finally be told, and justice, long delayed, will at last be served. As we followed him from the room, I could feel the weight of guilt and fear pressing down upon Greystone Manor like a physical presence. Somewhere in this house of secrets, a murderer was planning their next move, knowing that with dawn would come their final reckoning with Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. The grey October morning settled over Greystone Manor like a shroud, its mist clinging to the ancient stones as if reluctant to witness the final act of our drama. Poirot had arranged for the entire household to assemble in the library at precisely 11 o'clock, the same room where Charles Pemberton had met his death, the same balcony that had received his broken body. The symmetry was deliberate, calculated to maximize the psychological pressure on the guilty parties. The suspects were arranged with mathematical precision. Lady Pemberton sat rigidly in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her aristocratic composure intact, but her pale eyes betraying the strain beneath. Sir Geoffrey stood by the French windows, his usual arrogance replaced by barely controlled agitation. Dr. Arbuthnot huddled in a corner chair, his hands trembling more violently than ever. Esperanza sat beside me, her dark eyes fixed on Poirot with desperate hope, while Inspector Japp positioned himself near the door with 2 constables, their presence lending official gravity to the proceedings. Poirot entered last, moving with the ceremonial dignity of a high priest approaching the altar of justice. He had arranged his evidence on a side table with characteristic precision. The leather button, Charles' final letter, financial documents, and a leather portfolio I hadn't seen before. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "we gather to solve a mystery that spans 5 years and encompasses 2 murders, systematic fraud, and a conspiracy that reaches into the very heart of what should have been a respectable English family." He moved to the evidence table, lifting the leather button with reverent care. This small object, torn from a gentleman's shooting jacket during a deadly struggle, represents the thread that unravels our entire tapestry of deception. But before we examine its significance, we must understand the motive that drove 2 people to commit murder. Poirot turned to face Lady Pemberton directly, his green eyes boring into hers with surgical precision. "5 years ago, madame, your husband discovered that you had been systematically embezzling from the family trust funds, specifically from the South American railway investments that formed the cornerstone of the Pemberton fortune. These were not legitimate losses, as you claimed, but deliberate diversions of capital into private accounts." Lady Pemberton's voice was ice-cold. "These are monstrous accusations, Monsieur Poirot. I demand you produce proof." "But of course," Poirot replied smoothly, lifting the leather portfolio. "The proof is here. Bank records obtained by Inspector Japp this morning, showing transfers from the Pemberton Trust to an account in your maiden name. Identical patterns appear in the management of Miss Valdez's inheritance, which invested in the same fraudulent company." He began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "When your husband threatened to expose this fraud and change his will to remove you as trustee, you faced complete ruin, social, financial, and criminal. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Arrange an accident." Dr. Arbuthnot made a strangled sound of protest. "I never knew. I thought it was merely to protect the family reputation after a tragic riding accident." "Ah, doctor," Poirot interrupted gently, "you provided the medical testimony that made the deception possible. A diagnosis of hereditary vertigo, despite never having formally examined the patient. Your cooperation was essential to the success of the plan." He moved to the center of the room, commanding every eye. But Lady Pemberton could not have committed murder alone. The physical act required someone younger, stronger, someone with their own compelling motive to see Charles dead. Enter Sir Geoffrey. Sir Geoffrey's face had gone ashen. "You cannot prove anything against me. This is all speculation and the ravings of traumatized witnesses." "On the contrary," Poirot replied, producing a document from his waistcoat. "Your bank records show a deposit of £25,000 3 days after your uncle's death. Your share of the embezzled funds used to pay gambling debts that would have ruined you socially and financially." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Poirot raised his hand for silence. Charles discovered this conspiracy when Miss Valdez's inheritance revealed the pattern of fraud. He confronted both of you, threatening complete exposure. You could not allow that, could you, Sir Geoffrey? Your entire future depended on silence. Inspector Japp stepped forward, his notebook open. "We also have the testimony of Philip Cardew, who witnessed the murder from the servants' staircase. He saw Sir Geoffrey leaving the library immediately after Charles's death, his shooting jacket torn at the sleeve. The jacket that has mysteriously disappeared from your wardrobe," Poirot added. "Burned, no doubt, after you realized the significance of the missing button. But you made one crucial error. You failed to account for witnesses." Sir Geoffrey's composure finally cracked. He wouldn't listen to reason. "We offered him a share of the profits, promised to make restitution gradually, but he was obsessed with that Argentine girl, talking of marriage and moral obligations. He said he'd rather be poor and honest than rich and corrupt." "So you killed him," Poirot said quietly. "It was an accident," Geoffrey burst out, his face flushed with desperation. "I only meant to frighten him, to make him see sense, but he grabbed at my jacket. We struggled, and he fell. I never intended—" "Murder is always intentional," Poirot interrupted, his voice steel-hard. "The moment you chose to meet violence with violence, you became a killer." Lady Pemberton had risen from her chair, her mask of aristocratic dignity finally slipping. "You fool, Geoffrey. I told you to be subtle, to convince him gradually, but you had to resort to your usual crude methods." "Aunt Eleanor, please," Geoffrey began desperately. "Silence," she snapped. "It's finished now. Your bungling has destroyed everything." She turned to Poirot with terrible composure. "You are quite correct, Monsieur Poirot. I orchestrated the embezzlement, I arranged my husband's death, and when Charles threatened to expose us, I instructed Geoffrey to silence him. We are both guilty of murder." The confession fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and horror. Inspector Japp moved forward with his constables, the handcuffs clicking with metallic finality. As they led the conspirators away, Esperanza turned to me with tears streaming down her face. "Charles died because he was good," she whispered, "because he wanted to do the right thing." "Yes," Poirot said softly, his voice heavy with sadness. "And that, mademoiselle, is both the tragedy and the triumph of this case. Evil destroyed itself through its own greed and desperation, while goodness, though it paid the ultimate price, ultimately prevailed." Later, as our train carried us back to London, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, gazing out at the countryside rolling past. The case was closed, justice had been served, but the cost in human suffering weighed heavily upon us both. "Tell me, Hastings," he said finally, "what have we learned from this affair?" I considered carefully. That appearances can be deceiving, that greed corrupts even the most respectable families. "True, but incomplete," Poirot replied, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision. "We have learned that murder is never an isolated act. It spreads like a poison through families, corrupting relationships, destroying trust, creating new victims long after the original crime. Charles Pemberton died not just because he discovered fraud, but because he represented everything his killers had abandoned: honor, integrity, the courage to do what is right, regardless of personal cost." He paused, his green eyes reflecting the gray English sky. "In the end, mon ami, this case reminds us that the greatest crimes are often committed not by strangers in dark alleys, but by those closest to us, family members who should protect, not destroy. That is perhaps the most chilling lesson of all. As London's familiar streets welcomed us home, I reflected on the girl from Buenos Aires who had reached across an ocean for help and found it in the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot. Justice had been served, but at a price that would haunt Greystone Manor for generations to come. In his methodical way, Poirot had restored order from chaos, truth from deception, and justice from corruption. For him, as always, that was enough.